My name's David Manchester. I'm a dual MPP Hornstein student. And so today I'm going to be talking about increasing enrollment in Jewish early childhood centers focused here in the Boston area. So a little bit about the plan. I'm going to talk about the Combined Jewish Philanthropy, who they are, and the problem they identified. I'll talk about the data sources that I used in my analysis, and then talk about the evaluation criteria that I used to look at 6 different policy options. And finally, I'll discuss my recommendations for the Combined Jewish Philanthropies. So the Combined Jewish Philanthropies, CJP, is a Jewish central funding agency. They're the model that United Way was eventually built upon, as well as the whole federation system in the United States. Last year, they raised around $55 million, which was distributed to 100 organizations worldwide. And CJP is really known in the community as being extremely strategic in the way they go about their business. So their geographic coverage includes all of Suffolk County, downtown Boston, as well as a large portion of all the surrounding counties in metropolitan Boston. And within this area, we have 35 Jewish early childhood centers. But what CJP noticed was that over the last few years, there's been a series of closures due to low enrollment in some of these Jewish early childhood centers. And so they were really curious to understand what are the factors that impact a family's decision about where to send their child, and as a central funding agency, what they can do to support these organizations to address these challenges. So why is Jewish early childhood important? Like any ECE, these centers focus on the cognitive development of the children that they look after. But if this was the only thing they offered, there would be no value-added proposition statement to have a Jewish early childhood center. So in addition to that work, these centers work to develop the Jewish identity of the children and the parents, introducing Jewish culture, Jewish religious practice, and Jewish ethical values into their lives. Additionally, these centers recognize that the size and scale of a Jewish network can have an impact on families' decisions for the rest of their lives. And so they seek to connect families to one another to help develop that network so they have a group that they can follow for the rest of their child's development. So for this analysis, I used 3 main sources of data. First was a survey recently conducted by Professor Mark Rosen here at Brandeis, interviewing Jewish families with young children in the Boston area. In my analysis, I utilized the individual questions instead of grouping them to do data reduction but get larger constructs, because it's oftentimes easier to explain to individuals the impacts that are occurring. And you'll see when I offer you the findings from the data and then my recommendations, that the recommendations are a little bit more broad, looking at the general idea that the data is showing. I also utilized longitudinal organizational data collected by JData, a program of the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies, also here at Brandeis, to look at the current enrollment levels, the utilization, and the potential impact that these programs can have. And finally, I looked at literature from around the US, both Jewish and secular. So in looking at the proposals that I'm going to offer in a few moments, I looked at really 4 criteria. First is the cost to CJP, which should be noticed is very different than the general cost of the initiative. And at times, you'll hear me differentiate those 2 values. Also, the time to implementation. Depending on the initiative, from the time CJP allocates funds to support the idea, there could be a different timeline to the moment that the Jewish community is feeling the impact and the benefit of that initiative. Additionally, as early childhood education is regulated by the state, it's important to consider if any of these proposals will force the institutions to come under additional guidelines. And finally, as CJP is just the central funding agency and not the program delivery agency, it's important to consider any resistance they might face from the organizations. And so I'll capture that in change management. So before I talk about the impacts that could improve enrollments, I thought it was important to take a look at what variables were showing a positive impact and having parents be more likely to consider or choose a Jewish early childhood center. So first and foremost is the importance that a family places on their child receiving Jewish education in early childhood. And that had an impact both on their consideration and their choice. A family social network appeared in 2 different ways. First, if a family prioritized that their friends have children in the same early childhood center, they were more likely to choose a Jewish early childhood center. But also, if the family had more children, they were also more likely to choose a Jewish early childhood center. And I think that's mostly from the analysis an impact that they've been interacting with other Jewish families. And finally, if they said that the condition of the facility was an essential component of their decision, they were more likely to choose a Jewish early childhood center. So the first major finding involved marketing. Families had indicated that they utilized a website, a local community email listserv, or utilize an information fair were less likely to consider and choose a Jewish early childhood center. And this is a big challenge because using these methods, we're not reaching the families that might come and enroll their children. And so we're losing out on an opportunity to increase our current enrollment numbers. So I'm proposing here that CJP work with these organizations to update and improve their existing marketing strategies and marketing materials. So this proposal will be low cost. CJP will likely be providing a consultant to these organizations, but many of these updates could be done potentially in just a few days as long as the organization prepares the text that they want to include. As a result, the time to implementation would be very low as well. There would be no regulatory challenges, as these are marketing ads to the parents. I don't think anyone's going to be trying to advertise to the toddlers themselves, and so you're not going to fall under any child protection marketing rules. And finally, I think there will be very little resistance from the organizations, because this is really something that's going to be a one-time supplement to their existing operations and not really push them to change how their pedagogical approach. There might be some resistance around them having to type up the copy, but I don't think that will be so substantial. The next big finding involved a major social change happening in the United States. In the 1960s, around half of American households had a stay-at-home parent. And today that number has dropped down below 30%. However, even given this change over the last 50 years, many Jewish early childhood centers have not redesigned their curricula and their offerings to accommodate these families that are dual working and need longer hours. Families that indicated that they needed infant care were significantly less likely to even consider a Jewish early childhood center. Currently in the Boston area, only 2 of the 35 centers are eligible and able to handle infants. Additionally, families that said that they needed an earlier drop-off time, which also strongly correlated to a later pickup time, and those families that said that they needed year-round support were less likely to choose a Jewish early childhood center. So my recommendation here is that CJP work with these organizations to expand to full day, full year, and infant care coverage. Now, to CJP, the cost will probably be low to medium. Again, they're most likely going to be providing consulting support around the redevelopment of curricula and the strategy to roll this out. But there will be additional costs to the organizations themselves. The time to implement will be low to high, depending on potentially, especially if you do infant care coverage, you might need to redesign some classrooms. You're going to definitely come under additional regulatory challenges, and so those will add to the time. And all 3 of these options will increase the regulatory impact that these organizations feel. This will probably have the greatest change management and resistance of all the proposals, because many of the Jewish early childhood directors have voiced concerns about the amount of time children are spending in early childhood centers these days and away from their families. And they voiced opposition to this type of an idea, but I thought it was still important to present given the data. Finding 3, if we look at the second finding as a convenience factor around time, this is a convenience factor around location. And so the survey found that the closer a family lived to a Jewish early childhood center, the more likely they were to consider and choose one of those centers. Additionally, a family that said that they wanted to select a center that was on their way to work were less likely to choose a Jewish early childhood center. So this finding is a little bit easier to visualize than necessarily just the words. So 2 schools provided Professor Rosen the addresses of all the families that have their children in their centers. So the first center is in a high concentrated Jewish neighborhood. And here we see a strong clustering of these households living within 1 mile of the Jewish early childhood center. The other school is in a low concentration Jewish neighborhood. And here we see a more dispersed clustering, but still the vast majority of households live within 3 miles of the Jewish early childhood center. And these numbers are very similar to what you would see on a secular and a more general level. But these 2 schools isn't enough to really make a decision and a policy recommendation. So I looked at the immediate suburbs of Boston proper. And in this area, we have around 20 Jewish early childhood centers. But similar to the graphic we were just seeing, it's important to not just consider the location, but the coverage they may offer the community. So to do that, we can again look at a 1, 2, and 3 mile radius from each of those centers to understand their reach. But again, that might not be enough to understand smaller trends that are happening in the localities. So I'm able to layer on the survey results. So here, 1 green dot in Somerville is representing a family that lives in that portion of Somerville that shows a Jewish early childhood center. But that one individual is not the full data set, and so we can start adding individuals to this map. And in total, around 50% of the respondents to Professor Rosen's survey chose a Jewish early childhood center, now each represented by their own individual green dot. But choosing a Jewish early childhood center was just one of 3 options a family could have decided on. About a quarter of the sample only considered a Jewish early childhood center, now on the map with yellow dots, and another quarter of the sample did not even consider a Jewish early childhood center, now represented with red dots. And so as you look at this map, there are really 2 areas that stand out that could be addressed by CJP. The first is at the top of the map, focused in Arlington and including parts of Cambridge and Somerville. And so if we zoom into this area, we see that part of Arlington is not even covered by any Jewish early childhood center. And we only have 2 centers towards the eastern part of Cambridge and Somerville. As you explore this area, you see that compared to other parts of the region, they have many more individuals who are considering or not even considering a Jewish early childhood center, and fewer that are actually choosing one of those centers. And so this finding became even more important as I started to look at J data and the data that the schools are reporting. J data showed that of all the early childhood centers in Metro North, a region that CJP defines that includes other schools not in this map, there was only the capacity to handle another 17 children. So this means even if CJP made a big marketing push to encourage families to enroll their children, the community currently does not have the capacity to accommodate those families. Additionally, if we look right outside Brookline, for those who are less familiar with the Boston area, that's a community called Jamaica Plain. And here in JP, we see another area where a lot of families are either considering or not even considering a Jewish early childhood center. Like Arlington and parts of Cambridge and Somerville, there isn't a convenient ECE to these families. While there's some in Brookline and the surrounding areas, they would have to go in the reverse direction to a downtown commute. And so it's very unlikely that some of these families will choose to add that given the traffic in this area during rush hour. So the element that these 2 neighborhoods have in common is that JP and Arlington are becoming extremely popular for families with young children because of their lower real estate costs. So these families are able to get the house that they want to raise their children in at the price level they're able to afford. So my proposal here to CJP is that they work with these organizations and the existing organizations in these regions to introduce and create new Jewish early childhood centers to support the families that are moving to these neighborhoods. So this is going to have a medium cost to CJP. They likely will provide some consulting support, and there are other possible funding means that they could utilize to engage and support these organizations. There's going to be a high timeline to the impact that we're going to see because we're going to have to renovate buildings, potentially buy new buildings, and support these organizations as they can create a whole new infrastructure to support these families. Additionally, as these centers don't currently exist, they're going to have to come into compliance with every early childhood regulation that the state has. So there's going to be a high regulatory barrier to entry. And finally, I think there's going to be about a medium change management. Potentially some of that resistance could come from CJP, depending on how much these organizations need and support to get these centers started. Potentially a little bit it could come from the existing early childhood centers who might feel threatened that this will take some of their children away from them. And it also could come from these organizations that CJP will approach who might not have considered the idea of starting a Jewish early childhood center and might be hesitant initially to take on that financial risk to really put in the capital improvements needed to open the center. So my recommendations really fall into 3 categories. For existing schools, I'm recommending that if the school has available capacity and the leadership is open to change, that CJP starts off working to improve their marketing materials. And this hopefully will help them reach new families and start to fill some of those spots. Additionally, if there is that interest, CJP could support them in adding full day, full year, or infant care coverage. And these expansions will open these centers up to support families that they otherwise have not been able to support. And that will help fill those open spots. If a center does not have capacity, CJP, if they can prove that the need exists for expanded capacity, could support them in their area in opening up more classrooms and doing what they need to handle more children. But additionally, I still think that CJP should support these organizations and provide marketing material and updates for them. Because while they're being successful right now, it wouldn't be worth the risk that in a couple of years they start struggling because currently we didn't supply the limited funds needed to really update their marketing. I'm also proposing some changes around expansion. So the first one I recently spoke about, which is working with existing organizations to open new early childhood centers in Arlington and JP, as well as potentially Cambridge, Somerville, and a few other areas. The other two, because of time, I didn't have the ability to go in deeply about, but you can always ask questions. And that's to introduce Jewish programming at secular Jewish early childhood centers and to work on government advocacy around universal pre-K. And finally, in terms of funding, you see again, universal funding for universal pre-K, but also the support for financial vouchers for the first year a family chooses a Jewish early childhood center. And that actually is a recommendation that I'm not encouraging CJP take on at the moment, and I gave them a few expectations that I would see should be met before they would consider providing that type of funding. And so with that, I'll take your questions.